Thank you, Senator Smith. The time is now for question time, and I'll move first to Senator Ruston.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Farrell. Minister, last week the Senate agreed, without dissent, to the Coalition's second reading amendment to the National Health Amendment Bill, requiring the listing of all medicines approved by the Pharmaceutical Benefit Advisory Committee on the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme. Is the government policy to list all medicines approved by the PBAC on the PBS?
Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and thank Senator Ruston for her question. Well, of course, we have seen what the Liberals do when they are in control of the health budget, and of course we've seen what Leader Dutton did when he was.
Senator Birmingham, wait to be called. Senator Birmingham.
A point of order on direct relevance. As you point out, interjections are generally, indeed always, disorderly, but you allow some degree of latitude. But what we outrageously have here is the Leader of the Government in the Senate responding to interjections that are really not interjections, they are prompts from the ministers sitting behind him. The opposition, the coalition, was silent as the minister was answering. I'm going to ask you to draw him into the question.
Order. Senator Birmingham, order. I'm waiting. Senator Birmingham, you got 2 feet. Please do the respect and listen to my response. That is not a point of order, but I am going to remind the Minister of the question. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. And of course, it was the Curtin and Chifley governments that took the first. Well, it's worth putting it in its historical context, because. I mean, I won't repeat what I said earlier about Leader Dutton's performance in this area, but it is worth pointing out that the Curtin and Chifley governments took the first steps to make medicines affordable for all Australians post the Second War.
Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Ruston.
President, on a point of order in relation to relevance, I would ask you if you could reflect on the Minister's answer so far to this question, which I believe has gone in no way to my question that was very specifically targeted to a vote in this chamber or an agreement in this chamber last week to say that all medicines that were approved by PBAC would be listed on the PBS. I'd ask you to draw the Minister's attention to the question.
Thank you, Senator Ruston, and I'm sure you noted that I have already directed the Minister to your question, and I will direct the Minister again. Thank you, Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. We're listing medicines and we're making them cheaper for all Australians. The government is committed to ensuring Australians have access to affordable medicines by listing medicines recommended by the Independent Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee, the PBAC, on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme. The government has delivered on our election promise to cut the cost of medications for millions and millions of Australians by reducing the PBS co-payment to a maximum of $30 per
Minister
script.
Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Ruston.
Chair or President, on a matter of relevance again, I have not asked about the co-payment for medicines. I clearly asked about the listing of PBAC-approved medicines on the PBS.
Thank you, Senator Ruston. You did refer to the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, and I think the Minister is being relevant, and I will listen carefully to the remainder of his question. Senator Ruston.
The same point of order. They are 2 different things.
Thank you, Senator Ruston. Minister Farrell, please continue.
Thank you, President. Since the 1st of July 2022, the government has committed additional funding for 67 new and amended PBS listings. A further 83 items were also approved.
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Ruston, first supplementary.
Thank you, President. Minister, last week the Senate agreed without dissent to the Coalition's second reading amendment to the National Health Amendment Bill, which called on the government to urgently intervene to ensure FIASP remains permanently available on the PBS for the 15,000 Australians who rely on it beyond the 6-month funding cliff. Considering this, when will the government announce to these 15,000 Australians that you have that a permanent, ongoing and affordable access to FIESP on the PBS has been agreed to by the government?
Thank you, Senator Ruston. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. And I think I indicated when I was asked this question last week that I do, being a diabetic myself, I do have some familiarity with the drugs that are on the PBS system. And of course the drug that you've just mentioned, FIESP, is a fast-acting insulin drug for diabetes. Minister Butler's, very important drug, Minister Butler's office was made aware on the 22nd of February 2023.
Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Ruston.
On relevance again, the question was very specific about the agreement of this chamber for the medicine to be permanently listed ongoing. I'm just asking the minister, through you, Chair, if he could please advise when the 15,000 people who rely on this drug are going to be advised of the decision by this government to actually permanently list it.
Thank you, Senator Ruston. I believe the minister is being relevant, and I will listen to the remainder of his answer. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. And I don't know why the opposition keeps asking me questions and then stops me from answering them. But let's see how we go. Minister Butler's office was made aware on the 22nd of February 2023 of Novo Nordisk's intention to delist the drug from the PBS on the 1st of April 2023. The government appreciates the distress that a delisting—
Thank you, Minister Farrell. Time for answering has expired. Second supplementary, Senator Ruston.
Minister, last week the Senate agreed, without dissent, to the Coalition's second reading amendment to the National Health Amendment Bill, which called on the government to urgently list Trikafta on the PBS for children aged between 6 and 11 years old with cystic fibrosis, noting that PBAC recommended it be listed in November last year. Considering this, when will the government announce the listing to the 500 children aged between 6 and 11 with cystic fibrosis who will benefit from the affordable access of this life-changing medicine?
Thank you, Senator Ruston. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Senator Ruston, for her question. Trikafta is a drug used to treat cystic fibrosis. The government will expand the listing of that drug on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme for the treatment of cystic fibrosis in patients who are aged between 6 to 11 years as quickly as possible. The Department of Health and Aged Care is working—
Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Ruston.
Can I just seek a point of clarification from the minister? Is he saying that the government hasn't agreed to do this? Is he actually saying that the
that's
chamber—
That's not a point of order, Senator Ruston.
So the agreement of the chamber is somehow being ignored.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Minister Farrell, please continue.
Thank you, President. I'll repeat my answer in case Senator Ruston missed it. The government will expand the listing of the drug on the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme for the treatment of cystic fibrosis in patients who are aged between 6 to 11 years as quickly as possible. The Department of Health and Aged Care is working with the company that produces that drug, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, to finalise all necessary listing—
Thank you, Minister Farrell. The time for answering has expired. Senator Sheldon.
My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Farrell. Over the weekend, we saw another United Labor government elected in New South Wales. And yes, we are all pleased. It was a clear message that the people of New South Wales want government to focus on the things that matter to them rather than focusing on internal party divisions and political point scoring. How will the Albanese government work with the New South Wales government to deliver meaningful outcomes for the people of New South Wales?
Senator Sheldon,
and indeed—
please resume your seat. Calling out across the chamber is incredibly disorderly, and not only that, it's disrespectful, because I've got a senator on his feet seeking to ask a legitimate question. Minister Sheldon, please continue.
How will the Albanese government work with the New South Wales government to deliver meaningful outcomes for the people of New South Wales and indeed all of Australia?
Thank you, Senator Sheldon. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. And can I congratulate, on behalf of the rest of your Senate colleagues, Senator Sheldon, for the terrific work that you put into the wonderful result on the weekend. And over the weekend, the people of New South Wales had their opportunity to have a say, and they spoke with a loud and clear voice as they voted for a fresh start under the terrific leadership of Chris Minns and Labor. The people of New South Wales echoed the messages that we heard last year from the people of South Australia, from the people of Victoria and for the people of Australia when they voted for Labor governments. People voted for Labor governments because Labor governments are focused on tackling the issues that matter to Australian people. People voted for Labor governments who are focused on their needs as opposed to the internal party fights as those opposite continue to do. We welcome the Minns Labor government. We will be working with the Minns government in the same way we work with all state and territory governments as we address the cost of living challenges people are facing as the result of a decade of Liberal and national neglect. We will support all state and territory governments to deliver support for Australians based on need as opposed to the colour-coded spreadsheets that the former Liberal national government relied on. And we will work with all state and territory governments to make Australians' lives better, because that's exactly what Labor governments do.
Thank you, Senator Farrell. Senator Sheldon, first supplement. Senator Watt, I've called you about 4 times. Senator Sheldon.
Now, it's great to hear how the Albanese government will work with the Minns government to deliver meaningful outcomes for the people of New South Wales and more broadly Australia. Can the minister update the Senate on the measures the Albanese government has already taken to make Australia lives much better?
Thank you, Senator Sheldon. Minister Farrell. Sorry.
Thank you, President. Thank Senator Sheldon once again for his very perceptive question about the links between the new Minns government and the Albanese government. And of course, the Albanese Labor government has been delivering meaningful outcomes for Australians over the last 12 months. In just 10 months, we've made childcare cheaper. We've made medicines cheaper. We've got an increase in the minimum wage. We've got a pay rise for aged care workers. We created 180,000 fee-free TAFE places. We've created 20,000 university places. We've expanded the Commonwealth Senior Card. We've extended paid parental leave. We supported regional first home buyers, and we've repaired international relations. We've delivered so much that I can't list it all in just the minutes that I have in this answer. But Australians can rest assured—
the time for answering has expired. Senator Sheldon, second supplementary.
Thank you for the very informative response. Unfortunately, many of the Albanese policies which are designed to tackle the cost of living pressures and make Australians' lives better become the subject of political games in this place. What messages does the minister have for those who are putting internal party divisions and political point scoring ahead of delivering outcomes for Australians?
Thank you, Senator Sheldon. Minister Farrell.
Thank President. Thank Senator Sheldon for his question. And I've noticed this issue too, Senator Sheldon, and sadly many Liberal and National Party members and senators spend their time fighting within their own party. They spend their time seeking to score cheap political points. They spend their time looking for the latest social media video instead of looking at how they can help make Australians' lives better, like the Labor Party does. I have a message to those opposite. Cheap political stunts don't help Australians with their cost of living challenges. They don't help put a roof over Australian families' heads, and they don't make Australian lives better. It's clear from the results in New South Wales this weekend, Australians' cheap political point scoring. I call on all of those opposite to stop the political games and work with this government to deliver meaningful change that benefits the Australian people.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Canavan.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. Look, my question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Farrell. In reference to the Greens' deal with the Albanese Labor government on the safeguard mechanism announced today, Mr Adam Bandt, the leader of the Greens Party, has said that the Beetaloo gas field will be required from day one to offset all of its emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 for domestic use. Will all new coal and gas projects require their Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions for domestic use to be offset from day one under the Albanese Labor government's deal with the Greens?
Thank you, Senator Canavan. I remind you I'm the President. Minister Farrell.
Yes, thank you, President, and thanks Senator Canavan for his question. And of course, after a wasted decade, of course, today is a very good day. We're legislating for a 43% reduction, and today's changes, of course, are how we're going to deliver that. The safeguards will be a clear, stable and common-sense framework for reducing emissions. And the only chance in this parliament to reduce emissions of the biggest 215 emitters in this country. And we thank businesses right across Australia and particularly the Greens today for their constructive dialogue. If the opposition has got some concerns about this particular policy, then you could have.
Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Birmingham.
President, again, a point of order on direct relevance. Now, Senator Farrell likes to go through the background part of a brief. These points of order actually give him time to be able to come to the specific question that was asked. So as he flicks through the pages in front of him, could we please draw him to Senator Canavan's very specific question about whether future projects will have their Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions for domestic use have to be offset? Will they or won't they?
Thank you, Senator Birmingham. Senator Mackenzie. Senator Birmingham, I believe the minister is being relevant, but I will listen. That question was very detailed. Yes, it had a direct ask at the end, but it was also very detailed. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. And look, the reality is this, and at some point, it must going to sort of strike the coalition that when you deal yourself out of the.
Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Birmingham.
Again, President. Direct relevance, the question went to a substantive matter of policy, not to whatever the minister wants to say about the opposition, but a substantive question of policy. Please draw him to the policy.
Thank you, Senator Birmingham. I will certainly draw the minister to the question. Minister.
Thank you, President. Look, the reality is, at some point, you've got to understand when you deal yourself out of the picture by refusing to negotiate.
Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Birmingham.
President, you did just draw the minister to the question, and he is flaunting your ruling, ignoring your ruling, showing disregard. I urge you to please be proactive in reminding him of that, or if need be, sitting him down if he continues to ignore you.
Senator Birmingham, I have drawn the minister to the question. I am. Senator McGrath, order. Minister, I ask you to direct yourself to the— Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Conversations across the chamber are disorderly. I've called the minister to the question. I'm going to call the minister to answer the question. Minister.
Thank you, President, and I completely reject the suggestion that I don't respect the chair, because I do. Now, the Safeguards framework will help deliver the commitment of Scope 1 emissions, given the cross-jurisdictional nature of Scopes 2 and 3 emissions. The government will refer Scope 2 and 3 emissions to the Energy and Climate Ministerial Council.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Canavan, first supplementary.
Thank you, President. In his statement, Mr Adam Bandt has said that the deal will stop many of the 116 Australian coal and gas projects that are in the pipeline for construction. Is this correct? Based on government analysis, how many projects will be stopped
Senator
and how many
Watt.
Australian jobs will this deal cost?
Thank you, Senator Canavan. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and thank Senator Canavan for his first supplementary question. You've asked some questions about Mr Bant's statements. Then I suggest you go and ask him about what it was that he intended to say. But as far as well, look, you keep asking me these questions. I start to answer them, and then you try and stop me from answering. Well, Australia's oil and gas sector will continue to play an essential role in guaranteeing the energy security of Australia and our regions. As we know on this side, gas is a key enabler for Australia and our region's net zero transition. And I might remind you, Senator Canavan, you used to have a policy of net zero by 2050. You may not have agreed to it, but that was the policy you took to the Australian people.
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Canavan, second supplementary.
Not net zero in 2050, it's net zero today. Right now, 500 Australians have jobs helping to construct the Olive Downs mine near Moranbah in central Queensland. The mine will also provide 1,000 permanent operations jobs. Will this new mine have to offset all of its emissions from day one? Will any of these jobs be impacted by the Albanese Labor government's deal with the Greens?
Thank you, Senator Canavan. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. And again, I reiterate, once the coalition decides to deal themselves out of the debate, well then you can't complain when, in order to implement the policies that we took to the last election, including our policy to get to net zero by 2050, which was also your policy, and of course, if you cared so much about these places, of course, you Senator Canavan, would have pushed your party and the rest of the—
Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator Canavan.
Thank you. Just on a point of order on relevance, the question was clearly about the 500 jobs, and those workers, Minister, deserve an answer to know if they have a job tonight. It's not a question that I'm asking. I'm asking on behalf of them.
I'm aware
they
of the
deserve
question.
an answer, Minister. Do they still have a job after they wake up tomorrow?
Senator Canavan, resume your seat. I am going to remind senators that point order. Senator Canavan, and Senator Ayres. I've just had you on your feet. Senator Canavan. Order across the chamber. Senator Watt. Order across the chamber. Senator Canavan. You've just been on your feet with a point of order. As I went to respond, you engaged with other senators in interjections across the chamber. That is disrespectful. I'm also going to remind senators in this place, if you jump on a point of order, make the point of order succinctly. Don't make points of debate at the end of it. Minister Farrell, I'll draw you back to the question.
Thank you, President. And as you know, I'm a well-known supporter of coal workers, as was very clear. The government supports scientific, independent and evidence-based decision-making when it comes to the resources exploration and other commercial developments. The coal industry generates more than $10 billion annually in royalties and provides
Thank you, Minister.
over—
The time for answering has expired. Senator Cox.
Thank you. My question is for the Minister for Trade and Tourism, Minister Farrell. The government has updated the Thrive 2030 strategy to invest and increase the visitor economy in Australia. In this document, there's considerable mention of increasing First Nations tourism sector, which is welcomed. However, it's important that we invest in First Nations tourism, that we ensure that our cultural heritage is protected and First Nations people are beneficiaries of this investment, especially considering the recommendations of the Dukin report. My question is, how will Thrive 2030 protect First Nations cultural heritage as the First Nations tourism sector grows?
Thank you, Senator Cox. Minister Farrell.
Thanks, President, and I thank Senator Cox for her question. And I know, particularly based on my frequent discussions with her, just how important this issue is to her, and just how important getting this part of our tourism sector right is important to the country generally. As you say, in the revised Thrive 2030 project, which was relaunched a couple of weeks ago in Sydney with all of Australia's trade ministers, including, interestingly enough, both the Liberal Trade Minister and the incoming Labor Trade Minister. This government is all about improving the lives of Indigenous Australians in particular, and as you know, we're promoting the recognition of Indigenous Australians through a voice to Parliament. In a sense, everything else sort of flows from that commitment, because what it means is, as a government, we see not only the opportunity of improving the lives of Indigenous Australians through greater tourism focused on the Indigenous experience, but also projecting to the world the commitment that this government has got to in particular, Indigenous issues. In all of the discussions that I have with companies overseas, we promote Indigenous tourism as a unique aspect to the Australian tourism experience, and I'm extremely hopeful that, based on that revised Thrive 2030, that we can build on what we're already doing in this space.
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Cox, first supplementary.
Thank you, Minister Farrell. How does Thrive 2030 fit with the government's broader trade strategy, and in particular creating economic, social, environmental and cultural opportunities through capacity building and investment growth, particularly in relation to the ratification of the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, which was recommendation 2 of the Jukin report, which your government committed to?
Thank you, Senator Cox. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and again thank Senator Cox for her first supplementary question. The focus of the government, of course, in terms of our trade strategy has been one of diversification. We've learnt from bitter experience that putting all of your eggs in one basket, whether it be tourism or trade or education, has some real downside risks when that particular aspect of the economy that you've devoted your resources to, there's a change of economic circumstances there. So by promoting Indigenous tourism in this country, by promoting the experience that people overseas can get by engaging in that Indigenous experience, we think that's part of our overall diversification.
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Cox, second supplementary.
Thank you, Minister Farrell. How will this government, in the implementation of Thrive 2030, uphold Australia's obligations under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, such as free, prior and informed consent, and again the ratification in the Convention of the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage from 2003?
Thank you, Senator Cox. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and thank Senator Cox for her second supplementary question. I don't think you've got a government in this country more committed to raising and promoting the issues of Indigenous tourism in this country. And it's not just because it's the right thing to do. There's actually an economic advantage. In the post-pandemic world, every country is trying to get some aspect of their tourism experience which will attract tourists back to their country. This offers a real opportunity for Australia to have a unique offering which will achieve all of the...
Oh, sorry, Senator Cox. Senator Farrell was blocking my line of sight.
Question was quite specific about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and free and prior informed consent, and I didn't once hear the minister refer to that.
Thank you, Senator Cox. Your question also went to the 2030 matter and other matters. Minister, please continue.
Thank you, President. We are committed to all of our international obligations, but more particularly later this year—
Minister Farrell, the time for answering has expired. Senator Marielle Smith.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister for Finance, Senator Gallagher. Can the minister please update the Senate about the impact of unfunded or terminating programs on budget deliberations and how the Albanese government has had to clean up the mess left by the Liberals and Nationals?
Minister Gallagher.
Thank you, President. I thank Senator Smith for her question, and yes, I can update the chamber on just the work we are doing to clean up the mess that's been left behind by the Liberals and Nationals when in government. We all knew that the former coalition government was addicted to spending taxpayers' money like it was Liberal Party money, and we heard Senator Rennick outline that in one of his contributions last week. The October budget also uncovered, if people remember, $4.1 billion of holes that we had to address in terminating measures, in funding cliffs and in zombie measures, some which had sat before the parliament till 2016, propping up the budget with a decision taken in 2016 and never moved upon. And we've had more time to go through the books.
Order.
The May budget would deal with more of the spending traps that the coalition deliberately baked into their bottom line, leaving the budget billions of dollars worse off. More funding cliffs for government programs, like no ongoing funding for My Health Record, no ongoing funding for public adult dental health, chronic underinvestment in the key cultural institutions that Australians treasure and are crumbling around us, literally crumbling around us. No funding for key commitments made by the former government. Remember, the Olympics were 50-50, the Brisbane Olympics, but no provision made. No provision for the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Underfunding and erosion of capability in key public service agencies, meaning government can't deliver services, like the Department of Agriculture, and drop-offs in funding for the Australian Radioactive Waste Agency. Do you reckon we might need that after December? What about the National Emergency Management Agency? And what about the E-Safety Commissioner? Do you reckon they might need ongoing funding to keep their programs going?
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Marielle Smith, first supplementary.
After coming to government, what has the minister discovered about the economic mismanagement of the coalition that confirms the electorate's distrust in the Liberals and Nationals?
Senator Smith, thank you. Minister Gallagher.
Thank you. Yes, I can. We've inherited $1 trillion in debt and ongoing $50 billion in structural deficits with not enough to show for it. The former government spent money on rorts and ways to bolster their electoral chances with nothing to show for it. Our first budget in October uncovered those unlegislated zombie measures, banked since 2016 and not going to progress. Funding cliffs of programs which were ended purely to improve the forward estimates, even though any government would continue them. Failure to provision for necessary funding issues like COVID-19. And, of course, let's remember their big save in their budget on robo-debt. Remember when you pursued hundreds of thousands of Australians for debts they didn't owe to make sure your budget looked better than it was, and it backfired against the lives of those Australians, but also in the settlement you had to pay to get out of it.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Smith, second supplementary.
Thank you, President. What measures is the federal Labor government undertaking to dig the country out of the fiscal hole that the coalition created for ordinary Australians? And how is the Albanese Labor government working to protect Australians from pressures related to the cost of living?
Minister Gallagher.
Thank you, and I thank Senator Smith for her supplementary. Well, I think the Australian people know that the Albanese Labor government is one that can be trusted, both to be upfront with Australians about the state of their budget, We are cleaning up the mess and doing the job that the Liberals and Nationals refuse to do, funding the necessary services, funding the ongoing programs and addressing the spending shortfalls in key areas in the May budget. Unlike the Liberals and Nationals, our government will have the difficult conversations with the Australian people about the economic challenges that we face and make the responsible decisions to ensure a better future.
Please resume your seat. Senator Hume, I called you twice. I expect you to be silent. Thank you. Minister Gallagher, please continue.
Thank you. We're doing this work to ensure we can deliver for the Australian people, making room for targeted cost of living relief services that the Australian community expects. That's what Australians expect from their government, not a dodgy set of tricks and booby traps hidden in the budget to make your bottom line look better, all the while the Australian people suffer.
The time for answering the question has expired. Senator Roberts.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister for Finance, Senator Gallagher. Last week, Senator, I asked questions about the funding for the Deposits Guarantee Scheme, which was designed to protect the money in the bank accounts of everyday Australians, capped at $250,000 per account, $20 billion per bank and $80 billion total. Minister, when the scheme was brought in, the eligible deposits being protected were $650 billion. According to Schedule 9 of Budget Paper 1 of the October 2022 Labor budget, your budget, eligible deposits are now $1.2 trillion. Minister, how can $80 billion possibly protect $1.2 trillion in deposits?
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Minister Gallagher.
Thank you. And I think this question goes to some of the concerns that we're seeing in global financial markets at the moment, the impact on some banks overseas and some concerns that Senator Roberts is raising about the potential for impact here in Australia. And the answer is the same as I gave last week. Thank you, Senator Rennick. Would you like leave to speak to this question, or am I allowed to? Oh, you'd like to, would you?
Minister Gallagher,
sorry.
address your comments to
Sorry, President.
Order.
I know responding to.
Senator Rennick, resume your seat.
Tell us about your Masters of Applied Finance.
I know responding to interjections are disorderly, but Senator Rennick's got verbal diarrhoea, it seems, this question time. He can't keep it in. And as I said last week, this is something the government is monitoring closely. In fact, the Treasurer is being briefed twice a day on what's happening overseas, and also being provided with feedback from regulators and from the banking system here. And I think it is very good, and I would think that it's something that this Senate would welcome, is the fact that our financial markets, our system, our banking system, well-regulated, well-led, well-capitalised, with good liquidity, we are not seeing the issues that are being seen overseas. Now, I did undertake, and I'm not sure if we've done this, to provide you with a written response to the question that you raised last week, and I'll chase that if that hasn't got to you. But also, if there is anything further I can provide in relation to the answer I've just given.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Roberts, first supplementary.
Thank you. My constituents, as I expressed last week in the last question, are concerned. Minister, the protected amount is not indexed and would need to be increased to $380,000 per account and $115 billion overall, just to cover the same amount as the scheme did in 2008 because of inflation. Minister, will you increase the caps on the bank deposit guarantee to make up for inflation since 2008?
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Minister Farrell.
Thank you. Well, and in line with the answer I gave last week, of course the government would respond in relation to concerns that were raised about the operation of our banking system and the impact it was having here. We are not seeing that. I think Australians should be reassured that the Australian banking system is resilient, and all of our banks, as I said, are well capitalised, have strong liquidity coverage. Thank you. The Treasury and regulators are closely monitoring the situation about potential impacts for Australia. And when I say that, very closely monitoring. Now, I can understand that people watching what they've seen with Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse and that would have raised concerns. I can understand that, and the response is that since the GFC, since the Banking Royal Commission, there are measures in place to ensure the strong performance of our banking system, and we don't have any concerns about it.
Minister. Senator Roberts, second supplementary.
Thank you. Reviewing the minister's answers to my 5 questions on the guarantee so far. Firstly, the guarantee has not been adjusted for inflation, and so it offers 34% less protection than when it was legislated. Secondly, the guarantee is not funded. There is no money available to implement it. Thirdly, the scheme only covers 7 cents in the dollar of deposits. Fourth, the minister has refused to commit to activating the scheme if it was needed. Minister, can you explain why constituents should not conclude, as many have, that the bank deposits guarantee is a fraud, is a lie?
Thank you, Senator Roberts. Minister Gallagher.
Well, I don't agree with that representation by Senator Roberts at all. And I have answered the question in a general sense by saying that if there were concerns, as we saw in the GFC, then of course the government and I presume the parliament would act. So the point I'm trying to make is that at this point we don't have concerns. We do not share the concerns. In fact, we've been given very strong reassurance by the regulators, by the banks themselves, by the systems that have been put in place by this place and the other place to ensure that we have a strong, well-regulated, well-capitalised banking system to precisely insulate from some of the financial instability that we're seeing elsewhere. So, yes, of course the government would respond if we had to. At this point in time, we are assured that it's not the case.
Your time has expired. Senator O'Sullivan.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Farrell. Minister, the Presidents and other representatives from the Western Australian Shires of Leonora and Laverton wrote to the Prime Minister Albanese earlier this year about the increase in alcohol-fuelled violence that is ravaging their community, children not being fed and the increase in violence against women, all following the abolition of the cashless debit card. Minister, my question, very sincere question to you is, have these reports been verified by the West Australian Police, and what information does the government have about the changes in crime rates across these communities?
Thank you, Senator O'Sullivan. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and thank Senator O'Sullivan about an important issue that affects his community in these areas. Let's call them the goldfields areas of Western Australia. I understand there have been some meetings between the Laverton Shire and the relevant Albanese government minister. I think there's been some discussions with Mr Patrick Hill, the President of the Shire of Laverton, Mr Peter Craig, Shire of Leonora, Phil Marshall, Chief Executive Officer of the Laverton Shire Council, Mr Jack Carmody, Laverton Shire Councillor, and Mr Marty Sealander, Chief Executive of Pakenoo. And I understand those discussions and other positive discussions have been about what support services that those community leaders want to see in their community. And I understand there's been a willingness by the Shire to reinstate the Jobs Hub. There was, particularly in Laverton, I think there was some uncertainty about the long-term funding of the Jobs Hub because under the previous government, of course, it was going to run out in June. So I think there are some positive signs there. When it comes to the issue of alcohol use in remote
Thank you, Minister.
and
the
regional...
time for answering has expired. Senator O'Sullivan, first supplementary.
Reports published on the weekend indicate that the number of offences committed in Ceduna has doubled since the cashless debit card was abolished 4 months ago. Minister, given you didn't quite answer my last question about the police, I'd ask you, in relation to South Australia, have the these reports been verified by the South Australian Police, and what information does the government have about changes in crime rates across the Ceduna community?
Thank you, Senator O'Sullivan. Minister Farrell.
Thanks, President, and thank Senator O'Sullivan for his question about Ceduna. I think the most recent reports that the Minister has received from her department indicate that there's been a decline in admissions and presentations due to alcohol and drugs or injuries in Ceduna. Stakeholders, well, I'm just telling you, I'm just telling you. I mean, you asked the question. You asked the question. I'm giving you a direct answer to the question. You may not like the answer, but with respect, Senator Ruston, you're no longer in charge of this area. You're no longer in charge of this area. We've got a terrific minister in the person of Amanda Richworth, who I know takes a very particular interest in issues in Ceduna.
Thank you, Minister.
As she
the
does.
time for answering has expired. Senator O'Sullivan, second supplementary.
Thank you, President. Months later, why hasn't the Prime Minister responded to the correspondence from the representatives of affected Western Australian communities, and when will he visit any of the negatively impacted communities?
Thank you, Senator O'Sullivan. Minister Farrell.
Well, as I recollect, one of your complaints was that the Prime Minister didn't go to Alice Springs when they were having a range of issues there. And my recollection is I saw the Prime Minister and Minister Burney both attending up in Alice Springs, and I do note that in the
Order. Minister Farrell, please continue.
Thank you. I do note that the Prime Minister has been to. I do note.
Minister Farrell, please resume your seat. Senator McGrath and Senator Watt. Calling out across the chamber constantly is disorderly. The minister is on his feet answering a question. Minister, please continue.
Thank you. I do note that the Prime Minister, I think I'm right about this, has either been to Western Australia 9 or 10 times since becoming the Prime Minister of this country, which is a lot more than in the previous 12 months.
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Faruqi.
President. My question without notice is to Minister Farrell, representing the Minister for Housing. Minister, reports last week revealed Australia is one of the worst places in the developed world to be a renter. Rents are a staggering 22% higher than they were in 2020, and renters in Australia are projected to pay $10 billion in rent increases this year alone. More people than ever are living in cars, caravans and tents. More and more people are struggling to pay rent and having to make the choice between rent and food, between rent and medication, between rent and childcare fees. Will the government finally do the same thing they did for energy caps and coordinate a national freeze on rent increases and coordinate national tenancy standards?
Thank you, Senator Faruqi. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and thank Senator Faruqi for her question. And I know her sincere concern about the plight of renters in this country, which the Albanese government shares with you. And of course, this government has been coming to the Parliament with solutions to the difficult issue of housing in this country. We know that a lot of people across Australia are struggling right now to find an affordable place to rent. We hear their concerns, and we hear your concerns, Senator Faruqi, and we are acting to address them. The answer to rental stress is a sustained boost in the supply of homes to rent. and a substantial investment in new social and affordable houses. And that's what this government is aiming to do, Senator Faruqi. The government struck a national housing accord between all levels of government, investors and industry to build the affordable homes our country desperately needs to boost the supply of new houses. In addition to the accord, we've now passed legislation for the $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund through the House of Representatives, although I note not yet the Senate. Our ambitious reform agenda to deliver more social and affordable homes right across the country includes the widening of the National Housing Infrastructure Facility with up to $575 million available to invest in more social
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Faruqi, first supplementary.
Minister, the government is cutting funding for 27,000 affordable National Renter Affordability Scheme homes, while proposing a fund that gambles $10 billion on the stock market, which doesn't guarantee a cent to be spent on housing, and last year would have lost $120 million. Do you accept that currently the government's housing plan will make the crisis worse for renters?
Thank you, Senator Faruqi. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. Well, I don't. I thank Senator Faruqi for her first supplementary question. No, I don't accept that proposition, Senator Faruqi. For instance, the regional first home buyer guarantee was brought forward by 3 months by this government, and more than 2,000 places have already been taken up, with hundreds of Australian families now in their new homes. With Help to Buy, a new program to help Australians get their own homes sooner. Establishing a permanent National Housing Supply and Affordability Council. The Interim Council has been operating since the 1st of January of this year, and it provides independent expert advice to government, but particularly developing a new national housing and homelessness plan. The government has been talking with state and territory housing.
The time for answering has expired. Senator Green. Oh, I'm sorry, Senator Faruqi. Please, second supplementary.
Minister, the government's own National Housing Investment Corporation has reported that Australia needs at least $15 billion a year in investment in public, community and affordable housing. How does the government justify proposing to spend $368 billion on nuclear attack submarines and only a maximum of $500 million on housing?
Thank you, Senator Faruqi. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President, and thank Senator Faruqi for her second supplementary question. I think you're, with due respect, Senator Faruqi, I think you're conflating two separate issues. One of the obligations, like it or not, that federal government have is to ensure the defence and security of Australia, and the Albanese government takes that issue seriously. And that's why we've made some announcements in the last couple of weeks in terms of defence. We are bringing to this parliament a very significant reform package in terms of housing, which will, we believe, assist both people getting into their own homes, but more particularly renters, ensuring that they have an opportunity to rent and there's downward pressure on those rents. Can I say this? That project of this government was much more likely to succeed.
Thank you, Minister. Your time has expired. Senator Green.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister for Emergency Management and the Minister representing the Attorney-General, Senator Watt. Can the Minister explain why funding certainty is important for essential government functions like emergency management and national security, and what happens when governments don't plan for the future by providing that certainty?
Thank you, Senator Green. Minister Watt.
Thank you, President, and thank you very much, Senator Green. As a Cairns-based senator, I know you've provided a lot of support to regional communities experiencing floods and other disasters in your time here. In the 10 months that I've been Minister for Emergency Management, I've obviously seen a lot of floods. Every time I visit a different flood or storm-impacted community, I hear the same stories over and over again. People keep saying, it's always flooded in the past, but never like this. Or they say, this exceeds anything we've ever seen before, or this isn't normal. And this pattern was evident all the way back in 2019 with the Black Summer bushfires, when we saw unprecedented fires in Queensland rainforests, when we saw the entirety of Kangaroo Island under a bushfire warning, and when we saw fires across New South Wales and Victoria burn for months. It's been blatantly obvious for a very long time that long-term investment in disaster funding and taking action on climate change has been required. And while those of us on this side of the chamber have acknowledged the impacts of climate change for some years, those opposite are still living in the dark ages. These ideological beliefs and climate wars have hamstrung their ability to prepare for natural disasters. The fact is that for nearly a decade, the Coalition failed to make our country more resilient to the impacts of natural disasters. And despite all the evidence over all those years, they seemed to think that the disasters would stop. In fact, they even came up with a precise date that they thought the natural disasters would stop, and that was the 30th of June this year. Now, I say that because it's that date that nearly 25% of the funding for our national disaster agencies runs out. That's right. The former government, under Senator Birmingham and Senator McKenzie, didn't fund their national natural disaster agencies past the end of this financial year. According to the forward estimates, if the Coalition had won the election, our national disaster agencies could not have continued operating.
Senator Green, first supplementary.
Thank you, President. Minister, how is this funding uncertainty impacting on the Commonwealth's ability to support states and territories in responding to the increasing number of natural hazards?
Thank you, Senator Green. Minister Watt.
Thank you, President. Thank you again, Senator Green. Now, let me repeat that. Under the former government, 25% of the funding for our national disaster agencies runs out on the 30th of June this year. So despite all of the floods, all of the bushfires, all of the cyclones, they just said it's going to be okay, it's going to stop raining on the 30th of June 2023 and we won't need that funding beyond that. Now, what does that funding uncertainty mean? Well, what it means, if it's not fixed by our government, is that our network of recovery support officers around the country is impaired, along with our ability to provide payments to disaster-impacted communities and any national planning to build national resilience. They're the things that would have occurred had the Coalition won the last election. As I say, it's almost as if the Coalition thought that these events would just stop and that everything would be fine, the sun would come out, we'd get precisely the right amount of rainfall in precisely the right areas, and we'd never have to worry about natural disasters. This is the economic vandalism we've inherited, and we're fixing up the mess.
Senator Green, second supplementary.
Thank you, President. Minister, how could former governments have better prepared for the increasing number and intensity of natural hazards?
Thank you, Senator Green. Minister.
Thank you, Senator Green. Well, maybe as a starting point, the former government, when it was preparing its budget just before the election, could have thought, well, you know, we've been having a lot of floods lately, we've been having a few bushfires lately, a few cyclones. Maybe we need to make sure that our National Natural Disaster Agency has the funding to continue its operations. But no. Their budget, Senator Birmingham's budget, Senator McKenzie's budget for the Emergency Management Department actually was going to cut 25% of the funding for that agency from the 30th of June this year. Since our election 10 months ago, the Albanese government has shown that no matter what state or territory you live in, when a natural disaster strikes, we will be there with you and we will provide the funding that is needed to respond properly to natural disasters. And that's why we've been fixing the neglect of the past decade. We're overhauling the Emergency Response Fund, the $5 billion fund that never built a single project, with our Disaster Ready Fund. We're overhauling disaster funding arrangements. We are fixing the mess that we have been left in so many portfolios, including disaster management.
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering has expired. Senator Scarr.
Thank you, President. My question is to the Minister representing the Prime Minister, Senator Farrell. Is it correct that the Keating government released the Solicitor-General's advice provided to the then-government's advisory committee ahead of the referendum to establish an Australian republic? Is it also correct that the Gillard government released the Solicitor-General's advice in relation to border protection policies?
Thank you, Senator Scarr. Minister Farrell.
Look, I don't know the answer to either of those questions, but I'm very happy to make some inquiries and find out what the answer to those two questions are.
Thank you, Minister Farrell. Senator Scarr, first supplementary.
Well, Senator Farrell, I can save you the work and say it did. And given these precedents, including the provision—
Just a moment, Senator Scarr.
The senator knows the answer to the question. Why? What's the point of asking me the question?
Minister Farrell, that is not a point of order. Senator Scarr.
Given these precedents, including the provision of Solicitor General's advice for the last proposed referendum to change the Australian Constitution, will the Albanese Labor government make the Solicitor General's advice relating to its proposed constitutional amendment available to the Australian public and the Parliamentary Select Committee that it proposes to establish?
Thank you, Senator Scarr. Minister Farrell.
My understanding is that the Attorney-General is not proposing to make that advice public.
Thank you, Minister Farrell. Senator Scarr, second supplementary.
Thank you, President. On what public interest ground? Is the Albanese Labor government refusing to release the Solicitor General's advice relating to its proposed constitutional amendment prior to Australians having to cast their votes on it?
Thank you, Senator Scarr. Minister Farrell.
Thank you, President. Thank Senator Carr for his second supplementary question. I'll ask the Attorney-General to come back with an answer on that question.
Thank you, Senator Farrell. Senator Farrell.
I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper. You're too slow.